Today we have Lynne O'Donnell. She's a war correspondent, a confident journalist. She has a perspective about international relations, global terrorism, and human religion. It's an honor to have you, Lynne, today. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Okay, now I really want to know your perspective on global international relations in the contemporary world.
Oh, well, that's a pretty broad subject to start with. Would you like to bring it down to some specifics to start off with?
Yeah, definitely. I want to see your take on the global international relations and how Pakistan, being a strategic location, and its relations with Afghanistan. Once you mentioned that Pakistan is a prism of Afghanistan in the Canning Conversation podcast. So what was the motivation behind that, and what was your experience before visiting Pakistan?
Well, as you probably know, I was a foreign correspondent based in Afghanistan for quite some time. And while I was there, the war was really raging. It was a US NATO operation against the Taliban, and it was very clear to us as foreign correspondents that Pakistan, the Pakistani military and its associated intelligence organisation was giving a lot of support to the Taliban. Without the support of the Pakistan military establishment, the Taliban would not have been able to survive or thrive or indeed win the war after 20 years.
An additional thing, Lynne, you have also had being a bureau chief of Kabul, right? And what were the challenges that you faced that time?
Well, I was a bureau chief in Kabul between 2009 and 2017, so quite a long time. The challenges that we faced was covering the war as comprehensively and as evenly and in the most balanced way that we could, while keeping everybody safe. I had big bureaus based in Kabul, multimedia bureaus doing text and photo and video, also putting together packages and working as a production house for international television and documentary production companies that wanted to come into Afghanistan. But I also had a large number of stringers all over the country, and it was my responsibility as bureau chief not only to get the news, get it first and get it the most accurately, but also to keep everybody safe. So I could say that I took the safety and security of my staff as the most serious of my responsibilities throughout my time.
Lynne, in July 2021, you reported from Bamiyan province about the harrowing situation of women and girls from Saigon districts to escape forced marriages with Taliban commanders. Your reporting highlighted how insurgent, demanded names and ages of females, including widows, and used violence against male relatives. Can you elaborate on the conditions these women faced and the challenges you encounter in bringing this story and light and the broader implication for human rights under Taliban rule?
Yes, well, if I start at the beginning, I went back to Afghanistan as a freelance journalist, covering the war mostly for Foreign Policy magazine. And I had worked for more than 10 years with an Afghan photographer called Masood Hosseini, who's a close friend of mine as well as a colleague, and he won a 2012 Breaking News Pulitzer Prize. He was also freelancing at the time, so we got the band back together. And because we were freelancing, we had no restrictions on our movements. When you're working for big media organisations, they are obliged to have insurance on for their people, and the insurance companies are obliged to have security reports on a daily basis, and it can be very restricting because you're at the hands of people deciding yes or no. You can do a story, you can go to a place without knowing anything about the real on-the-ground situation. So Masood and I found ourselves able to make our own decisions and our own risk assessments. And so we went to very many front lines across the country doing pretty good stories, if I may say so myself. And we went to Bamiyan in July, as you said. And our original idea was to go and join a Hazara militia group who were hiding out in the hills, and they'd been accused of some some atrocity. It doesn't really matter. We decided that they hadn't done it, and so there wasn't a story in it for us. So instead we went back to Bamiyan City, the capital of the province, and we interviewed the governor. The governor told us that there was a city in the middle of the mountains, a town called Saigon, where the Taliban had taken control for 4 days before being pushed out by the local militia. And at this stage, militias, local citizen militias, were a big part of the effort to try and keep the Taliban at bay. During the 4 days that the Taliban were in control of Saigon Township, they showed really how their functionality was to roll out. They split into different committees in charge of different aspects of the initial steps towards governance, if you like. And one of the things that they did was to order the mullahs to use the mosque loudspeakers to inform everybody that they must provide the Taliban with lists of names of all women and girls in Saigon. And the reason for this was that they were going to marry them off to Taliban fighters. The Taliban have a system, an ideology, a principle of basically taking the spoils of victory as their own, and this includes everything material and human beings as well. And the women were to be the spoils of war and the big thank you and reward for Taliban fighters who had helped take Bamiyan, Afghanistan, however it rolled out. We got in a car, in a convoy, Masood and I, and we went to Saigon, which is really very remote. We didn't have telephone signals, or we were really right in the middle of nowhere. And we talked to the local police, they verified this story, and then we started talking to local residents and merchants. There were no women to be seen in the street. And this town, if I can describe this town to you, Saigon was basically one road, a white sun-bleached concrete road down the middle of 2 rows of shop fronts. And the shop sold everything from sacks of spices to ice creams to mobile phones to plastic flowers you put in your house. So we walked the length of this white concrete road, followed by men, boys and children, all of whom were wearing different coloured shalwar kameez. The fashion was coming from Pakistan, Chinese-made clothing, and the you might know this, Afghan men are very flamboyant in their dress sense, and so it was really quite a parade of colours and matches, and it was great to see how the clashes and the matches in the colours were put together. I have some great photos. Anyway, we walked the length of Saigon Main Street, the only street, and went into a store selling mobile phones and plastic flowers, and we started to talk to the man behind the counter. Other men came in, they were curious to know who we were and what we were doing, and they started talking to us about this experience they had had in the 4 days that the Taliban held power, held control of Saigon Valley, really. And one of the men said to us, my wife and my sister and my cousin have all come back now. Would you like to come back to my place and meet them and talk to them? So of course we said yes. And we went back to his home, and he was a maths teacher at a local school, and we talked to his wife, they were newlyweds, and his sister, they lived in the same house, and his cousin came from a house nearby, and they told us the story of what had happened and how they had reacted. And it was a story of real horror, to be honest with you. When they heard that this is what their fate was to be, the women, almost without exception in Saigon, threw together what they could into a bag, and they got out of Saigon, and they left the town in any way that they could. If a relative had a car to drive them, they took that. They took taxis. They put a suitcase in a wheelbarrow and pushed it. They walked. They just got out of town. And they stayed out of town until they were told that it was okay to come back. But even when we were there, which was about maybe 4 or 5 days after the Taliban had been pushed out of the valley by the local militia, most of the women had yet to come back. They were terrified. These women told us that they were still having nightmares about it. They could hardly talk without crying about the implications of it. So we clearly we had a pretty good story. There'd been a lot of rumours up until this stage of what was happening in places that the Taliban had already taken control of. We were in July. The Taliban assault on the country was rolling out it was a very clear strategy. They closed the country from the outside in, and they were squeezing into the centre and towards the bigger centres of administrative control. They hadn't yet taken Helmand or Kandahar or Herat, for instance. But as I was saying, rumours had started to fly around about the way people were being treated in cities and provinces, and even districts and district townships that were already under Taliban control. And what we were hearing was that local media organisations were being closed down, journalists were being hunted down, and a lot were fleeing. I'd already met a lot of them who had come into Kabul, and women were being told that they had to stay at home and had to leave their jobs and leave their education. This was the first real confirmation of those reports that were at that stage only rumour.
Oh.
So we wrote the story. Masood had great pictures. We had the stories from the people that we spoke to. We took notes. We took voice recordings. We took video recordings. And Masood, of course, also took still photos. We had everything that you would need to verify a story. And it just exploded everything because it was the first confirmation of what the Taliban, who we had interviewed, we'd interviewed Zabiullah Mujahid beforehand, and he had laid it out. Nobody really wanted to believe the reality of what was coming, of what the Taliban really were. At this stage, very high-profile figures in the international civilian and military landscape were saying, we've got Taliban 2.0, we can work with them, it'll all be fine, because there had been a psychological capitulation already. And so, our story really, Masood likes to say, it landed like a bomb. That's how he said it. And there is no better way to describe it.
Okay, I want to ask you about your recent article in Spectator, in that you mentioned about women being sexually assaulted by the Taliban. So, after that story, has any action taken by the Afghan government or any international community?
Well, the story that you're talking about was based on a very deep reportage by an Afghan media organisation called Hashd Sub, 8 a.m. It was a very well-respected newspaper that was delivered daily at 8 a.m. Throughout most of Afghanistan, in most of the provinces, but was really considered a newspaper of record during the Republic time, a very respectable organ. Now, what they did was an investigation into the way women prisoners, mostly of Uzbek minority nationality, were being treated in 3 northern provinces. And there was a lot of detail in there. No named sources, of course, but what they reported was that women in prisons imprisoned on no charges because there's no law in Afghanistan, on very flimsy premise such as not wearing hijab properly, non-Islamic dress, this sort of thing, were basically being treated as sex slaves by their captors. And the detail was really horrific, as you can imagine. It went into great detail about how some women were being taken out of the prisons, taken to the home of local Taliban commanders, being abused overnight. You can imagine, well, we don't want to imagine, but we have to imagine what those circumstances were, and then delivered back to the prisons during the day, or Taliban people coming into the prisons overnight and raping the women in their cells. So pretty horrific stuff. It didn't get, when the story was released, it didn't get a lot of traction. So I called up Richard Bennett, who is the special rapporteur for human rights in Afghanistan for the United Nations. And I asked him what he thought about it. Mm-hmm. And he said, we've launched an urgent investigation into the allegations. Now, Richard Bennett has been to Afghanistan already a number of times in the 3 years since the Taliban retook control in August 2021. He's travelled to a lot of places in the country. He's heard a lot of horrific stories, and he's done some very thorough reporting on it and called for action and change, which hasn't come. And he said, we think that given what we know and what we've heard to date, that there is enough credibility in the nature of these reports for us to investigate. So that was the story that I did for The Spectator. I didn't do I've talked to a lot of people, of course, about the situation that women are facing under the Taliban regime, and I didn't think that it was outside the bounds of imagination to think that this was true. And so I talked not only to Richard Bennett, but to Afghan people I know who are keeping an eye on this, women's rights activists and international rights groups as well. So that's the story. That's the story of the story that you're mentioning. Yeah.
Yes, Lynne. Taliban was afraid of your reporting, and they detained you in 2022 as well, which was very much highlighted in global media. Similarly, you had interviewed Mohsen Dawar, whose interview is very rare in national media channels in Pakistan, and who is considered a red line, unwritten red line in our media to be interviewed. So, did you face any harsh response from the government of Pakistan?
No, none at all. None at all. I wonder whether they even know that you're talking to a podcast that I am producing for 8 a.m.
Yes.
And I have known Mohsen Dawar for some years, and he is one of the few people that I have met in Pakistan's political landscape who are willing to talk openly and on the record about what he calls Project Taliban, and to talk about it in very specific details about the threat that the Taliban and their offshoot TTP pose to Pakistan's national security. There are others, Afrasiab Khatak, for instance. I talk to him sometimes. He will go on the record. But these sort of people are brave. And as we know, Mohsen Dawar has faced very grave personal threats to his life because of his political opinions and outspokenness.
Okay, one last question. As at one place you answered a question, were you scared living and reporting in Afghanistan? And you responded, of course. Fear is a sign of intelligent life. This is a very interesting statement. So how is there a relation between fear and intelligent life? What do you see about that? How is there a relation?
I will preface this with a story. I met somebody, I was taken to meet somebody in Karachi on Friday afternoon, and I'd never met him before, and he'd only heard about me the day before when a mutual friend said, "Can I bring Lynne to come and meet you?" And when I got there, he presented me with a coffee mug on which he had printed, "Fear is a sign of intelligent life." And it wasn't really until then I saw it, and then he put my name underneath it. It wasn't until I saw it that it dawned on me that this is, as you say, an unusual thing to say. People usually fight their fear. They don't want to be afraid. But, I covered war for a long time, and I was in some very, very dangerous situations for a long time as well. And people, they like to say, "Aren't you afraid?" Of course I'm afraid. I'm afraid of being shot, blown up, kidnapped. While I was in Afghanistan, I think that the biggest threat that I faced on a daily basis was being kidnapped. There was a time there where kidnapping people like me was quite fashionable. Carjacking, car hijacking, and kidnapping out of cars, holding people for ransom.
In addition to this, you were forced by the General Directorate of Intelligence to denounce the integrity of your work. You were forced to give an apology for the work you have done, for the reporting you have done, about the Afghani girls being abused by the Taliban. So what do you think? What was that time? How was threatening, and how much it was mentally disturbing for a journalist to still on the ambition, because they were pressurizing you.
Well, the same thing. There wasn't if we just put those two questions together, there wasn't a moment that I wasn't afraid. Now the fear. I think what the fear does, it's boost your adrenaline production, and the adrenaline keeps you sharp. But at the same time, I remember when they told me that when they came to my guest house, 4 of them armed and took me away, I had that squeezy feeling in my gut that said, this is pretty serious. And I had no idea how that episode was going to end, how long I was going to be held, whether I was going to be, end the day in a hole in the ground. They threatened to kill me, have me killed. They threatened to put me in jail. When they told me that I should make a confession, my feeling was, whatever it takes. It's not going to change the person I am, and it's not going to change the fact that everybody in the world knows that my reporting is accurate. It's been proven to be accurate. Whatever it takes. And so that's what I did. I did whatever it takes. I said to them at one stage, so how does this end? They said, well, you have to say sorry.
Or we can say it's all one of the con of doing the war journalism, because many people were not dare to do that. Because somehow, if you are bringing the story from the scratch, so what you see the future of journalism after this?
The future after this? After this. For me, or generally?
In the journal perspective, if you see for the war journalism, if the military is very harsh, abusive, threatening, not letting the journalist to do the real insights.
Oh, well, the military is not. The American military will let you do anything. Militants, that's the hard part. The militants don't separate, they don't believe in journalism. Okay. So I think that they regard journalists in the same way as they regard we're the enemy. If we're not manipulable, then we're the enemy. Just being a woman makes me their enemy, let alone a foreign woman. So I tick a lot of boxes for people like the Taliban as the enemy. The future of reporting on war, I think that's a very difficult one. I think that as long as we can maintain a semblance of freedom of expression and free media, we'll be okay on one side. It's the other side we have to worry about, and we can only really rely on the reporting that we do remotely, I think. Yeah, as we are in Afghanistan now. You know, you've got 40 million people effectively held hostage by a group that is led by terrorists, and our access to them is very limited. I think that's the sort of reporting that we are going to be having to do, as long as we're able to make phone calls and talk to people on social media. And yeah, so journalism is facing a troubled future as it is, for very many reasons, but really difficult journalism like covering war and covering the other side of war is going to become more and more problematic, I think.
Okay, well, Lynne, it was an equally enriching experience to have you today, and we wish you all the best for your future endeavors, and for a newbie like us in the journalism, we feel that you are a true inspiration for all of us.
Great.
Thank you for joining from CEJ Studio. Stay tuned. Goodbye.